The American Cotton Shippers Association, also known as ACSA, is a trade association primarily made up of cotton merchants, founded in 1924. ACSA members manage the majority of the world's cotton trade, providing services of merchandising, delivery logistics, and risk management to their customers. ACSA will be holding its 101st annual convention in Palm Beach, Florida in June of 2025. For more information on ACSA, including their convention, view their website or Twitter account at Cotton Shippers.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of Cotton Grower Magazine's Cotton Companion podcast. I'm Jim Stedman, editor of Cotton Grower, and I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and colleague, Beck Barnes. Now, Beck, after all the rain, wind, and damage from hurricanes in parts of the Cotton Belt back in September, we're now into, like the fourth consecutive week of open harvest weather, pretty much all across the Cotton Belt. Rain showers have been few and far between. Obviously, it's allowed growers to take advantage of some warm temperatures and favorably dry conditions to speed harvest up and get this year's crop out of the field and on its way to the gin. Now, I drove through northern Mississippi a couple weeks ago and saw several recently harvested fields with rows of modules just waiting to be picked up. And from all accounts, gins across the area are already running hard.
Yeah, no doubt, Jim. Yeah, I also traveled this week, actually, from Memphis to New Orleans, or south of New Orleans. I went on a little fishing trip down there, did some inshore fishing with my cotton farming stepdad, and anyhow, I had a great time. But on the trip, yeah, man, you can spot those gin yards from way out in the distance. I mean, it looks like some sort of Easter egg configuration way off in the distance when you got the blues and the yellows and the pinks, just stacked up gin yards. A lot of harvesting activity happening all around. I know I am preaching to the choir. For anyone who is listening to this podcast, you are already aware, but yeah, I'm telling everyone I know to just encouraging everybody to be patient out there on those highways as the harvesters are out and about and trailers hauling round bales and modules. And anyhow, you guys know the score there, but yeah, it's good to see. It's been a eventful year. I know the folks, as you mentioned, over there in the Southeast have had their hurricane problems here late in the year, but it's nice to see, harvest happening, harvest humming along as normal.
Definitely. Well, with harvest running at full speed, it kind of naturally brings us to what should be considered the final phase of the 2024 planting year, as well as the beginning of the 2025 season. It's not deer season, which is another topic for another day, but it is time for growers to put their cover crop programs into action and get the fields planted for numerous soil health reasons and, of course, for weed suppression. So joining us today to discuss the value of those cover crops and to review some current research findings of interest is our friend Jessica Kelton, who's soil health educator with the Rodale Health Institute, and Dr. Drew Smith, who's chief scientific officer with the Rodale Institute. I visited with them just a few days ago, and we're going to share that discussion with you here in just a few minutes.
Yeah, that's right, Jim. Before we do that, actually, well, first thing we should mention, we're recording on Halloween, so we want to wish everybody a happy Halloween on this very spooky edition of the Cotton Companion podcast. Now that is that important bit of business is out of the way, what we'd like to do is to thank ACSA for their support, which you guys probably heard at the top of this episode. And we'd also like to welcome a very special welcome to the Cotton Board. They are a new sponsor of the Cotton Companion here for the next several episodes, and they have some comments to share with you right now.
The best thing you can put on your crop is your shadow. Your need to be in the field won't change, and the Cotton Research and Promotion Program was put in place to make sure you get the most from every minute you're out there. That's why the Cotton Board and Cotton Incorporated work alongside growers to spur innovation, fund research, and foster sustainability so generations of farming families can walk the same turn rows for years to come. You grow the cotton. The Cotton Research and Promotion Program helps grow the value. To learn more, visit cottonboard.org.
So as always, thanks to our friends at AXA, and a special thanks to the Cotton Board for their support and their messages.
Well, Beck, moving ahead, we do have a couple items of interest to the cotton industry that have surfaced here over the last couple of weeks. We'd certainly like to share those as well.
Yeah. As we mentioned, the 2024 cotton harvest is moving along thanks to some very favorable weather conditions. And the latest USDA crop progress report for late October shows how far growers have already come in getting that crop out of the field. So the report shows that 52% of the U.S. crop had been harvested as of October 27, and that is an 8 percentage point increase over the previous week and a full 6 points ahead of the 5-year average for the date. In all, harvesting 13 states is running ahead of average, with the Mid-South states leading the way with harvest percentages ranging from 90% in Louisiana down to 66% finished in Tennessee. Despite widespread pockets of drought and late season storms, the overall crop condition still looks decent, with 64% of the crop rated fair to good to excellent. Unfortunately, that leaves 36% still rated as poor or very poor in this week's report. Now, on a more promising note, BASF's Liberty Ultra herbicide received U.S. EPA registration and is now approved for use subject to state approvals. The next generation of Liberty herbicide from BASF, this new post-knockdown herbicide is effective on both broadleaves and grasses and is available for use on glufosinate-enabled cotton, soybean, corn, and canola acres. Now, in research trials, Liberty Ultra demonstrated 20% superior weed control and won 9 out of 10 head-to-head comparisons against generic glufosinate products. This new combination gives farmers better weed control on grasses and tough broadleaf weeds like Palmer amaranth, water hemp, giant ragweed, and kochia. You can find more information about Liberty Ultra at cottongrower.com or by contacting your local BASF rep. And finally, the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol has released its 23/24 annual report showcasing record grower participation and notable strides in environmental stewardship. The report highlights the program's progress in driving transparency and continuous improvement across the cotton supply chain, even amidst a challenging economic climate for growers. Some key highlights for the 23/24 annual report include record grower enrollment, strong environmental gains, expansion of the Climate Smart Cotton program, advancements in traceability, and expanding collaboration with other organizations on a global basis. For more information about that report, you can find it at cottongrower.com. The entire report can be found online at report.trustuscotton.org.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, with 52% of the U.S. cotton crop now harvested as of late October, that also means it's time for growers to start putting their soil health plans and cover crop programs into action after this crop comes out of the field. So joining us today to discuss the importance of those next steps is our friend Jessica Kelton. She's a soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute, and Dr. Drew Smith, the Rodale Institute Chief Scientific Officer. Thank you both for taking time to join us today.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay. Jessica, let me start the discussion with you. Now, we visited before about the work and mission of the Soil Health Institute and the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund. Can you take a moment to give us just a quick refresher on those programs, especially for listeners who may be new to the podcast?
Yeah, so Soil Health Institute was founded in 2015, really did a lot of work on the science side, starting a few years ago, doing some outreach, because I think it's really important to get some of that research into the hands so it can be put into practical use. So I work with the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund. We work across the Cotton Belt from North Carolina to California. And really our goal is to help encourage the adoption of soil health management systems. And a big component of that are cover crops. And, cover crop use has been around for a really long time. But if you look at the numbers, we still have very few row crop acres in the U.S. that are in cover crops. And so, yes, it can be challenging, but I think we talked about it before we started this podcast, is just the market environment that we're in now. It's really hard to take on another input cost when it's hard to just even break even in the cotton world right now. So for us at SHI, we really thought, yes, we know that there's a big soil health benefit from using cover crops, but because it is an additional expense, what can we do and provide resources to growers to help point out that there's multiple uses for cover crops, and particularly uses that can help reduce your input cost in year one. So we worked with a group from Texas A&M and Rodale Institute to kind of find that research that's cotton specific on cover crops and kind of put it all into a one-stop shop. So anybody who's interested in using cover crops, particularly for weed suppression, could go and see what are the benefits, what do we need to consider, particularly this time of year when we're thinking about cover crops, what do we need to consider before we put them on our farm.
Okay, great. Now let's just go back and kind of break that down just a little bit. Again, like you said, I think we see some increases in cover crop use a little bit every year. Some years obviously more than others. Now, I don't know what's going to happen this year, considering the situation. But let's just start with, how do cover crops benefit cotton growers?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of benefits. Again, thinking from a soil health perspective, long-term soil health benefits, right off the bat, we can start seeing a reduction in erosion. We can have diversity in our system. We've got a better water infiltration system from adding cover crops in. So there's those benefits for soil health. But as a trained weed scientist, that's probably what I really focus on a lot, is the weed suppression potential of adding in cover crops. So I think, yes, we see a lot of growers who are using initially to reduce erosion, but if you can get weed suppression potential out of cover crops, I think that is another, really easy to see benefit of using cover crops.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've got, obviously, cotton growers are wrestling with a pretty broad spectrum of weeds. Yes. On a year-to-year basis, certainly with too many resistant varieties on it. How do cover crops kind of help suppress those weeds in cotton fields? And what should growers really consider when they're looking at cover crop species, more specifically for weed suppression?
Yeah, so I think what you typically see for if you're focused really on weed suppression is residue, and being able to plant a cover crop that can give you an adequate amount of ground cover after you terminate. But then particularly for those who've not used a cover crop before, with enough residue for weed suppression, but still have the ability to plant into it, because that's one of the challenges that growers can face whenever they're using a cover crop system. If they go out there and plant a high rate and get a really high residue, then planting into it can be a concern because they've not ever had to manage to plant through a high residue system. Mm-hmm. So, picking out a species that can give you that residue, but then something that's manageable for you. And if you've been doing it for quite a few years, then pushing that biomass as much as possible. Again, still challenges, particularly if you harvest late. When am I going to plant? Am I going to get the growth that I need before I have to terminate? And depending on what region you're in, how long am I going to allow it to grow? Particularly if I'm in a water limited area, that's a big concern on termination time. How much residue can I get? So I do think that choosing a species is probably a very specific thing. I don't think that there's one cover crop that works for a region. I think it's a case by case basis. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of resources out there for growers to look at. I don't know. I believe the Southern Cover Crop Council has some of their data on their website, but they've worked to have quite a few variety trials out throughout the Southeast that gives you an idea of the species that are out there, but also the variety. And so I think there is some amount of homework that has to be done by a grower to identify what they want out of that cover crop, mm-hmm. and B, what are they equipped to deal with.
Sure. I think and I think you've probably heard him say this before, but our friend Bill Robertson always says, if you're starting with cover crops, you're thinking about it or going out for the first time, says start simple. Start with a very, very simple mix of, just clovers and a couple of other things that I can't remember just because it's not I'm not obviously a weed scientist or soil scientist at all, but basically start simple and kind of see how it goes.
Absolutely. And I think that you're very much right. I think it's some trial and error on farm to see what works for you, and what works in your rotation.
Yeah. Okay. Now, obviously, now is a time for people to be starting to think about seeding cover crops as harvest is ending. From your studies, is there an ideal situation and timing for getting established? And I know, depending on when harvest ends, obviously, and quite honestly, is there a point where it's probably just too late for a grower to consider?
Those are really good questions. I think from a residue standpoint, as early as possible, but being in the deep south, you know how it can go I think we've had really good harvest weather this year and people have been able to get out and harvest. But if we're talking about in a year where harvest is really late, it's, maybe you've missed that optimal time for planting. And I asked this question of an agronomist a few years ago, when is too late? And I don't know that there's a research answer to that, but a practical answer to that is, have you already purchased the seed?
Right.
And I think that's probably the driver if you're getting in a situation where you've harvested really late. But I mean, if you have the seed or if you can obtain the seed for, a relatively cheaper price, then I think it's always good from a soil health perspective to always have some kind of living roots out there. So I think there's a benefit from planting it, but maybe not a 6-way cover crop mix is going to cost you quite a bit because you don't have the time to let that grow. So, I think asking people other farmers in your area, if they're planting, but I think there's probably going to be some things besides the, ideal or optimal times that come into that when you're planting late. So yeah, it's again, back to one of those individual farm things is, individualized for a farmer.
Right. And I found myself wondering, it may not necessarily be buying seed being the driving point this year, but I don't know what I'm going to grow this time next year. And maybe it's just a good benefit to go ahead and get a cover crop out there for regardless of what your crop's going to be.
Yes. Yeah, and I think too, just from my perspective, thinking about some of the climate smart commodity projects that are out there, there's incentives for more growers to grow cover crops. I don't know what impact that's going to have on cover crop seed or availability. So if you're planning on planting a cover crop, the earlier you can purchase that seed or figure out what seed you want is probably going to be best at this point.
Right. Okay. Well, let's look ahead to planting time next year. Any feel on ideal timing for terminating that cover crop and what termination options are most growers relying on at this point?
So again, termination time is going to come down to what are you planting? How many acres are you working with? But then I think it's a really big component of determining when you're going to terminate is just are you irrigated? Are you dry land? Are you in an area that gets very limited water? Those play, are really big key factors in determining when you're going to terminate. So just, I think again, individual farmers determining when they're going to terminate. From a weed suppression standpoint, the longer you can let it grow and get more residue out there is great, but you also have to look at your system to see what's going to work best for you. And then you had a second part of that, Jim, and I completely spaced on that.
Yeah, so what the termination options,
termination options. I think, working with Rodale, I think for this project, really, when we think of from a conventional standpoint, a lot of chemical termination is what we go with in those conventional systems because it's relatively cheap and effective. So, a burn down to terminate. Some growers are rolling their cover crop, but for an organic system, I think it's going to be a different approach.
Okay. And we'll get into that in just a couple minutes here. Now, I understand that Soil Health Institute and all you folks are getting ready to start a series of webinars to discuss some of this year's research work. You've got a series of fact sheets available to summarize some of those findings. Where can growers go to get those fact sheets and information on the webinars?
Yeah, so our fact sheets are already online. They're under our resources tab at the Soil Health Institute website. So I encourage growers to go take a look at it, because not only did we summarize what's out there, but if you really want to just get into the nitty gritty of it, we've got all of the research that all of this was pulled from listed in there. So if you wanted to go see, if you're an Alabama grower and want to go see some of the research that happened in Alabama, it's listed, so you can go take a look at it. So I encourage people to go there. Our highlights for webinar for this series of fact sheets is going to be December 4th. We don't have the registration link up yet, but feel free to reach out to SHI and we can get you that information as soon as it's available.
Okay, great. Now, Drew, you've been very, very patient. But I do want to ask you a little bit, first of all, about the work that Rodale Institute is doing. I think you mentioned you're just really kind of scratching the surface. You're getting started in cotton, and more specifically, obviously, in the organic cotton. If you would, please give us sort of a quick overview of the Rodale's mission, how it ties in with the work that Jessica and the folks at Soil Health Institute and the Regenerative Cotton Fund are doing.
Sure. So Rodale, we've actually been around since 1947, doing work mostly in what we'd call organic. Our founder, J.I. Rodale, coined that term organic when he started Organic Gardening magazine, that a lot of people, a lot of farmers, gardeners, but a lot of the early organic pioneer farmers looked to find resources. But soil health has been a pillar of our research from the beginning. And we're mostly a research organization. More recently, we've added consultants. So we have consultants around different parts of the country that can help farmers transition to organic, especially with that certification process and just understanding how to go through that process. And then we also have added education. So I would just say that probably as far as this conversation goes, we've been highly focused on how farmers can be successful in an organic system. And that starts with improving the health of the soil. So that's why we get connected with the Soil Health Institute. And then also the cover crops, because we know that, you think inputs are costly in a conventional system, they're even more costly in an organic system. So farmers have been asking the question, how do I grow a crop without being able to, buy synthetic nitrogen and put it on the ground or other sources of fertility? And that's been a large area of our research, is trying to understand and document and demonstrate scientifically that you can actually get enough nitrogen and fertility through the use of cover crops and compost and methods of that nature.
Over the course, if a grower comes in and he's planting a cover crop for the first time and he's trying to, setting himself up in an organic production, how many years does it take? A couple of years to kind of get that soil health, the nitrogen in the soil naturally, as opposed to, obviously somebody coming in and applying a fertilizer or nitrogen product over the top or at planting. How long does it take to get that soil where you want it to be in terms of nitrogen content?
Right. I mean, that's a little bit of a loaded question. If you had a bunch of soil scientists here, we'd all argue because soil is different everywhere you look. But I don't even, just in general, if you've changed a practice, you go to no-till or you start using cover crops. We usually see about 4 to 5 years before you start to see a difference. And I'd say that's sometimes with farmers I've seen, they use cover crops in year one and they say, well, it didn't really do anything for me. It didn't really work. I spent money and I didn't get the benefit that I wanted. But the real benefit we see usually starts coming 4 or 5 years down the road. And we've seen studies where, for example, you've used hairy vetch as a cover crop over 4 to 5 years, and then that provides enough nitrogen to produce a corn crop for several more years after that, those cover crops are being used. So it is a strategy, maybe you would call it banking your fertility, because you're building up your fertility over time. And we, for example, in our long-term studies, we don't use any fertilizer for our wheat. But in our conventional, we're applying 60 pounds of ammonium nitrate and we have equal yields. And that's largely because of the nitrogen that's been built up in the soil and then slowly released to the crop over time.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think before we went online, we were talking a little bit about where organic cotton is produced. And we know that in the big scheme of things, when you look across the cotton belt, organic productions kind of fits into some very specific niche geographies at this point. Do you have any feel for how big the organic cotton market is at this point?
Considering that marketing is not an area that I pay attention to as a scientist, maybe I should. I don't. I know there's interest. I see companies that would like to purchase organic cotton. It seems to me that Texas and California seem to be the places we tend to see organic cotton growers, and I assume that has to do with humidity and pest pressure that might be in the other states.
Any specific recommendations that you would have for a grower who's looking to get into organic production? Obviously, specific recommendations when it comes to putting cover crops into any kind of organic production.
Right. I think this really just adds to the things Jessica was saying. We, in the organic system, the cover crops are critical. They're really necessary to be economical. You have to grow your own nitrogen, really. Mm-hmm. So using leguminous cover crops or using, grass-based cover crops so you can hold on to your nitrogen and keep it from leaching into groundwater are critically important. So I guess that the timing is important when filling a couple of things like we heard earlier. Yeah, I think especially if you're in a southern location, it could never be too late. I was just thinking that I was in a field in Iowa in December, and somebody said, "Oh, it's the field that has the cover crop planted," and I said, "I don't see a cover crop." But I got down on my hands and knees and I said, "Oh, there's a few coming up here." But by April, that field was covered. It had a cover on it. So you have good erosion control in the spring when you have heavy rains. The other thing is that I was thinking about, especially if you're in more humid conditions, that the cover crop really helps dry those fields out. So if you're trying to get onto the field in the spring, it can really is a benefit to have the cover crop, and it provides some sort of friability. So it's better structure. Things fall, the soil breaks apart easier. Mm-hmm. From an organic perspective, considering weed management, something we've done is, well, I guess the other thing I would say is consider growing your cover crop just like your main cash crop. A lot of people are probably taking cotton off right now and they're thinking, we're exhausted. We got it done. Let's just throw some seed out there. And then you get very poor germination. Then you say, it didn't really do anything for me. So we like to tell farmers, especially since we can't use herbicides, you probably do want to scratch the surface a little bit with a disc or plow or something to ensure good soil contact. You'll see the difference in a couple weeks, because in 2 or 3 weeks, if you get rain, it'll be up and growing very fast and vigorously. Where if you just put it on the surface or even just drill it in, you tend not to have the quick growth. And that actually allows us to have some weed management where we could use something like a rotary hoe or a tine weeder and essentially go very quickly over those fields, even before the cover crop germinates, and eliminate most of the weeds that would be there on the surface. So now we're just scratching the surface, less than an inch into the surface to eliminate weeds. And then we're doing that to prevent next year's weeds, but we're also to improve the growth of the cover crop. So I think we think about it as we really want to get that good growth. And I think the other thing is crop rotation. We were saying before, when's a good time to plant cover crops or to even think about it? Really the time to think about planting your cover crop is 2 or 3 years ahead of time. And we plan our crop rotation so that we can get things like clover and vetch and rye and oats planted, and maybe winter pea at a time so that we'll get good growth. So those are other things that are critical aspects.
If any of our listeners are interested in finding out any more about this organic production, particularly maybe how it would apply to cotton, where can they go for more information about Rodale and some of your programs?
Sure. You can find us at rodaleinstitute.org. And if you are considered or interested in transitioning to organic, hit the consulting tab and you can find out more information about transitioning.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I'll tell you what, with that, it's probably time to wrap up today's discussion. Jessica, Drew, I certainly want to thank both of you for taking time to join us. I think it would be an understatement to say it's truly a challenging time for commodity production, not just cotton right now. So any new information or new programs that could potentially make a positive difference for our growers is certainly worth discussing. So again, thank you, and certainly hope to see both of you again soon.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. It was nice talking to you.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode of the Cotton Companion podcast. We want to say thank you again to Jessica Kelton with the Soil Health Institute and to Dr. Drew Smith with the Rodale Institute for joining us for today's discussions. Thanks also to the Cotton Board and the American Cotton Shippers Association for their support and sponsorship of the Cotton Companion. And as always, we want to thank you, dear listener, for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you did like what you heard, please be sure and spread the word. Tell your friends and farming neighbors about the Cotton Companion podcast. Here's where and how they can find us.
You can find the Cotton Companion in 3 easy ways. First, go to cottongrower.com/companion or simply click the podcast tab at the top of the homepage. Second, subscribe to our channel on iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts these days. And 3, sign up for our weekly e-newsletter, the Cotton Grower e-News, that's delivered to your email inbox every Tuesday morning. You can do that by going to cottongrower.com/subscribe. Also, be sure to follow Cotton Grower on social media. We are at Cotton Grower Mag on Twitter. And on Facebook, you'll find us by searching for Cotton Grower Magazine.
Cotton Companion Podcast is produced twice monthly by Tyler Hatch and Kim Henderson, our talented colleagues at the world headquarters for Meister Media Worldwide in lovely Willoughby, Ohio. I'm Jim Stedman, he's Beck Barnes, and we'll be back with you in a few weeks with the next episode of the Cotton Companion. Until then, stay safe out there.
Yeah, he works and he works and he works and he works all day. God made a farmer